Well, hello and welcome to the Psychedelic Diaries. I am your host, Ray Christian, and boy, do we have a show for you today. Jasper Simons, executive from the APA, will be joining us shortly. We'll do a deep dive and a soul search with him. As usual, we'll start with a nugget and a noodle, and we're going to be trying out a new segment at the end of the show where we take two companies in the psychedelic space, one for some praise and the other for a little bit of critique. Producer Kevin is here. And as usual, let's start things off with a nugget and a noodle. And today's news nugget, more progress on psychedelic legalization, but this time at the federal level. The House of Representatives rejected the proposal, but two things stood out. One, the very fact that federal legislators are proposing this is significant progress. And two, there's a little bit of growth in the acceptance. A similar bill was proposed in 2019 and was trounced, 333 votes to 91. This time, 285 to 140, shifting 50 votes. So more progress on psychedelic acceptance. Well, let's shift over to the noodle. Something I've been noodling on of late is that perhaps it's time to stop using the words trip and psychedelics. Now, Yuval Harari, in his landmark book, Sapiens, he talks about this idea of a myth, a social construct, cannot just be removed. It needs to be replaced. And the words we use have emotions and negative connotations. And this psychedelic renaissance is not your father's 1960s, 1970s drug culture Woodstock trip. This is focused, introspective, intentional work. So maybe we need some new jargon. For example, at the turn of the century, a new amphetamine really changed the world of therapy, but they didn't bill it as an amphetamine. They called it Adderall. So perhaps there's a similar path here. Well, that's it for a nugget and a noodle. Producer Kevin, do we have Jasper on the line? We do. Ladies and gentlemen, if I may direct your attention, he is the Chief Publishing Officer of the American Psychological Association, the venerable APA, Jasper Simons. Thank you for joining the show.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks for having me.
Okay, well, let's dive right in. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think you have any experience with psychedelics, which I think is a good thing because it brings objectivity. And psychedelics has a chance to greatly impact therapy and psychology. But let's take a step back, 10,000-foot view at the historical and cultural context in which science and research operates. Jasper, what do you think is necessary to substantially shift the way an industry operates, especially one that's as well established as psychology?
That's a great question, Ray, and thank you for having me. And I want to make clear that I'm not a psychologist and I'm not speaking on behalf of the APA, but I'm very excited to hear you explore these important topics. So I think as a publisher, I've been a publisher for the science spaces for more than 20 years and worked with many different disciplines and now in psychology for more than half a decade. The view on science is that it's a process. It is not kind of Albert Einstein and Newton sort of peaking one time and having a major insight. There's a lot of work that happens on a continual basis. So one view that Thomas Kuhn sort of had was this notion of paradigms, where there's paradigms that are in place for lengthy periods. And then there might be paradigm shifts that happen at a certain moment. And it's actually reminded me of a Twitter article that I just saw on the horseshoe crabs. These guys have been around for 450 million years. They've largely remained unchanged. So this is a little bit in line with the thinking from Stephen Jay Gould about sort of these punctuated equilibriums, where things sort of change, but then remain static for a very long period. So these horseshoe crabs, they saw the dinosaurs come and go. It's like a blip on their radar. They're still here, completely unchanged. And in science, sometimes you have, for a very long period, certain paradigms that remain largely intact. But there's always work happening sort of at the procedural level, at the specific level, where the existing theories are being tested out and tested out in new settings with new patients or with new methodologies. And that's important to keep in mind, that science is a process. Now, how to change it if you think that it's not taking into account important new developments, or if it's missing opportunities to address particular issues? There are a couple of things that I think are important to keep in mind here, is that technology can be a major sort of precursor to a paradigm shift. Government action can be a major precursor to a large shift in science. For instance, the genome work that the government really put their weight behind completely accelerated DNA mapping, or the accelerator in, Switzerland, CERN, where they can look at particle physics. The investment in those kinds of technologies completely changed the field. Now, psychology is a complicated matter because we're dealing with people, not with particles. And so cultural shifts are often the drivers of change in psychology. And maybe that's what will happen here at some point too.
Jasper, what a great call to this horseshoe analogy of 450 million years. And it's not as if evolution has stopped, but for that particular path, it works. And so we keep what's good. And we have other evolutionary paths and we add on to it, but some stuff, it sticks because it works. I love that. And it doesn't surprise me to see such a clever take, because when we worked together on the Innovation at APA series, I saw firsthand how you are pushing for technology and advancement in therapy and in psychology. And I'm curious, what do you see as perhaps the biggest roadblock for innovation in therapy?
Well, I'm not sure. Roadblock is maybe a tricky word, right? Because it assumes that there is kind of an end that you already want to go to. And science is often much more operating in the moment to test out maybe new things. And what I would say, though, is that what has to be in place is kind of foundational, sort of scientific validity. If there's a new treatment or a new approach, it has to be tested. It has to go through the rigor of the scientific process. So scientific validity is an important sort of fundamental piece. Then in the case of psychology, with practitioners in the field who are helping patients, it needs to be legal, whether you can use a certain drug, use a certain approach, and it needs to be reimbursable. So for a psychologist to be able to treat a patient, and it is not classified as a treatment that can be reimbursed for through healthcare or any of the programs, that's a huge roadblock. That's an obstacle. It's a practical obstacle. But the fourth one maybe that comes to mind here is probably the most interesting one. This is a cultural aspect. Are people ready, even if the science is there, if there's no legal barriers, if there's financial compensation for the practitioner to invest their time into it, are patients ready? And I think the psychedelics area is an interesting one where there's probably experimentation happening by patients who are at the end of the line. They don't have any other options, and they start experimenting with that. So was it the Nugget or the Noodle that you just shared about the shift in the thinking around this? That's a good indicator that people are considering the validity of some of these psychedelic research, because we published last year in 2020 in the Journal of the Psychology of Consciousness a comprehensive review of the validity of psychedelics in treatment settings, and there's some good data on psilocybin in particular for PTSD and certain other settings. I'm not, again, a psychologist and don't know the specifics, but I think culturally we do see a shift happening already, but there's still some barriers.
Very well put, Jasper. And I love this idea of it's got to be legal and it's got to be reimbursable. And then even then, we've got to get to a point where we've got this cultural acceptance. And I think I'm glad you mentioned psilocybin. If I could pick one, if I could go single issue politics, which typically is the way to do it, I would push for simply just psilocybin. But that's just my opinion. For you, though, I'm curious, as Jasper Simons, the executive, the man, I'm curious, at the APA now for some time, what's your favorite part about working at the center, at the hub of that industry?
That's a good question, Ray. It's fascinating having worked in so many disciplines. I spent a lot of time in oncology, in the science and technology areas of the research space, in anthropology. But psychology is so different because it is both the human is both the observer and the one being observed. And that odd kind of tension, not even tension, but that reality is just so fascinating and so different from many other areas where we bring ourselves, or psychologists bring themselves to the research equation because they're the ones asking the questions. They're the ones who are interpreting the answers on the people that they're researching and how they're behaving. And maybe even wonder, psychology is a young discipline. It's not been around for that long. If you think about philosophy or physics, or some of the other disciplines, they've been around for centuries. Psychology is fairly young, and sometimes I wonder, we probably know more about the surface of the moon than really about what happens when two people are interacting with each other.
That's really good. I love this concept of it's the observer and the observed. It makes me think about this concept of like particle wave function collapse where observation changes the outcome. And I think that certainly happens in therapy. And it's a relevant one, specifically in psychedelics, because of the issue of guiding. And many, many people need guide work. I have had my experience without a guide, and some of my most impactful trips have been without a guide. And I think it's specifically because there was no one there observing me and I could truly let go. And yet it's a critical part that a lot of people do need. Switching gears a little bit, Jasper, in my mind, you are one of the brilliant minds on the strategy side in today's society. And I'm curious, what's a hard-earned lesson of late? And what's the current challenge you're dealing with?
A hard-earned lesson today, to speak not about COVID and the vaccination rates, I think would surprise many. And it's been surprising how little people have changed. If you think about exactly 100 years ago, with the big outbreaks that we had then across the globe, the same concerns were raised about the science, about washing your hands and staying away from other people. And we've come so far with all the technology and innovations, but people are asking the same questions. So it really is a challenge how to, even if you have the data and the scientific research to back up that a vaccine has a lower risk of negative consequences than contracting the virus. And I'm fully vaccinated. I had very little effects, but people's concerns are real. They have a concern about what to do if they have that fear. And so we need to think much harder about how do we bring people along and how can we make it sort of culturally relevant to their situation, the misinformation that they might have gotten. How can we start kind of moving the needle to have people really consider the benefits of this action, even if it's not flawless. People feel crappy after many of the vaccines. It's not 100% effective in all the cases, but is it better than getting COVID? You bet it is. So that really is just a surprise how little we have changed as humans in the last 100 years. And the other one you asked about a current challenge. So what has been really exciting at the APA, what we've been working on, we have a fantastic portfolio of almost 100 journals, scholarly journals, peer-reviewed journals that cover sort of the full breadth of the psychology space. We have a wonderful books program. We have what we call an abstracting and indexing kind of a discovery tool, a psych info that researchers can use, undergraduate students, graduate students can use to expand the boundaries of the topics. But in the last couple of years since I've joined APA, we've been really serious about engaging with undergraduate students because there's such excitement in the field in colleges for the field of psychology. And we want to bring them along and create and have more psychologists in the field who can help people and can help organizations and move things forward. And what we found that once we create a learning solution for instructors that was based on science, and we proved that it encourages sort of engagement, it improves retention with students, and it gives the instructors more information about how their students are doing, that even though it's all correct and true, they are still very used to the old school textbook and their slide decks and the way that they've done things, and they're human. And that is the situation that we find ourselves in. And we have the real innovators sort of at the beginning of the Jeffrey Moore innovation curve. They're all on board. They love it. Their students love it. The instructors love it. But we're kind of going up that ramp of innovation and getting those crossing the chasm. I think that's the Jeffrey Moore term that he uses. That we want to really get into that the large corpus of colleges and schools and have them use psych-learn as a tool for teaching research methods, social psychology, developmental psychology, etc. But it's been an interesting journey to see how connected people still are to their old school ways.
Jasper, thank you for that share. That's a well-articulated concepts. And you made me think of with the COVID thing, where the challenge is it's hard to not talk about COVID. It's like you have to actively not talk about it. It makes me think of that thought experiment of don't think about a pink elephant. You can't, now you're thinking of a pink elephant. And with COVID, it's the same thing. It's hard to get it off the mind. And it knocked me on my butt when I got the vaccine too. So, but look, pay the price when you want to take some steps to improve safety. That idea around college kids and engaging undergrads, I think, is also very apropos, because you don't really think of an institution as big as education or even college education as something that can be disrupted. But in fact, it is being disrupted a bit with YouTube tutorials, online academies, General Assembly, other ways of getting information fast beyond just reading a textbook over the course of a semester. So it's important that these schools keep up with the times, especially when they're charging an arm and a leg. So I love that share. And switching gears a little bit to you, to Jasper Simons, the guy outside of the company, just you as a man, maybe perhaps at a halfway point in the career, already an impressive one. How do you approach your personal strategy in your career?
I've always been very interested in business from very young age. A friend of mine who I knew from primary school, in high school, we would spend evenings playing chess and talking about the companies that we would build and create, and the corporate path that we would take, and always been very fascinated by the pressure and the real focus on problem solving. If you don't solve a problem for a customer, you're not going to have a business. And I've always had that passionate interest. So I've been fortunate in that sense that I've had strong interest in one particular direction. But that's something that you need to first understand, right? What are your interests? You also need to figure out, well, what are your strengths? What do you bring to the table? And what's unique? And for me, when I've asked my former supervisors and managers over the years for feedback and 360 reviews, it was always strategy, analytics, and collaboration. Consistently across the board, those came up. But those are, for me, things that maybe come naturally, or that at least I've worked hard on to develop further. But you do need to know what your strengths are and do more of that. You can spend some time on your weaknesses, make sure that you don't completely crash and burn on that end, but you really need to know what your interests are and your strengths are. Now, I think what particularly is interesting when you're starting a career and you come from maybe not a fortunate background, you're not coming from the right zip code, you didn't go to the perfect school. You need to figure out kind of, well, what are the demands on you? Do you have a lot of debt load? Do you have family members that you need to take care of? Or are you more free to pursue whatever it is that you want? If you are single, you can move to wherever your company takes you. If you're partnered up, your partner needs to be on the same page. So there's kind of demands that impede on your opportunities. And I think you need to realize and be honest with yourself about what those demands are. And I think the last thing sort of to think about where you need to find an alignment between these factors if you really want to have a strong personal career and keep that velocity going is just to seize and seek out opportunities. You have to continually explore and try things out. That's why I reached, when you and I first talked about the innovation at APA, I wanted to learn more about what you were doing in the AI space, in healthcare. I didn't know much about it. I'd heard about it. But you are far further along in the exploration and actually the building of tools there. I didn't know. So I acknowledged that I didn't have a strength there. I saw an opportunity that might play out in my role as the publisher at the APA, and I sought out that opportunity to work with you on that. And I think those four things: your interests, what are they? Your strengths, what are they? What are the demands that are sort of impeding on your options? And then seeking out those opportunities. Those are four things that I think I would encourage people to always keep in mind, and acknowledge also that things will change. When you have a young child, when your children go to college, when your parents get older, when, I don't know, you face a sort of a disability or an issue on your own, you need to adjust to that and find a new alignment. So I think that's maybe my personal strategy in my career, to constantly seek out that alignment and work through that and sort of acknowledge that things need work. It's not once it's baked and done.
Oh, that's well put. I love this idea of seize and seek opportunity. And you mentioned with young children, getting them to a good spot where you can guide them along the right path. Quick thought experiment. Let's say you run into a 25-year-old aspiring executive and he or she asked you, "Hey, Jasper, I'm really impressed with your career. What advice would you give me if you could synthesize it down a little bit? What would you tell someone specifically at that 25-year-old mark, where sometimes people hit a little bit of that quarter life crisis where they feel accomplished, but they're not going to be a big time leader just yet? What might you tell them?"
Raise your hand. You've got to raise your hand. You've got to tell people that you are willing and eager and desirous of taking on new things. Just because you think it in your head, people can't read your mind. You have to raise your hand. And even if you're not comfortable, because maybe you grew up on the wrong side of town, or you went to a community college and you're sitting with a bunch of Ivy League grads, be the first one to prepare. If you have that meeting with your manager and your team, and you know your manager has been struggling with this issue, so be perceptive of what's happening in your environment and particularly with your direct supervisors. They struggle, as everybody does in their career, with problems that come their way that either have been there forever or they just hit their desk. Be there to help and raise your hand, even if you haven't figured it out. Just the imposter syndrome is a very interesting topic in psychology, and it's something that is a real burden to people as they kind of mature in their career. And when you're 25, you probably find yourself in these situations where you're still very eager, but you start to figure out, well, dang, there are a lot of smart people in this company or in this industry. And how do I stand out? You stand out by raising your hand and taking on a new challenge. And you got to figure out along the way, even if you fail in the challenge, people will recognize that you raised your hand. And you'll see also, this is sort of the concept of emerging leadership. Say you're in a team of 4, you have one manager. First meeting, you raise your hand, volunteer for a project. Okay, good. You take it, you get it, you work on it, you deliver it, it's okay or it's good. The second time, you do it again, you raise your hand. You know what happens the third time? Everybody looks at you to whether you raise your hand again. You have become an emergent leader. People know that you're eager to take on something. And they realize that, wait a minute, Ray last time did it, and they're kind of watching you, because people want to follow as much as leaders want to lead. And if you take on that challenge and figure out your way through that, it doesn't have to be perfect, but just raise your hand. And the second thing, maybe if I may add to that, is that travel. Travel different places. It doesn't have to be in person. You can travel in a book. You can travel on a phone. You can travel through a TV show or a documentary. But people are different wherever they are. cultures are different, approaches are different. And if you're an aspiring executive, you might make the assumption that people are just like you. First, you might make the assumption that people can read your mind, that you're an aspiring executive, and you need to correct that with what we just talked about. But you also might think that everybody's just like you, and that's just not the case. People have very different backgrounds, and travel is such a wonderful way of expanding your mind, understanding different cultures. And when you go to a resort, get out of the pool in the hotel, go book a tour with a local tour guide, ask them what's the restaurant they go to, not where they take the other tourists, where do they go to eat? And you get such great connections. And I think as an aspiring executive, to broaden your mind, to see the other opportunities, and there's no better way than to do it through travel.
Ah, that's really good. The diversity of experience from travel, I think you nailed it. I would probably throw, you and I might disagree, but I would probably throw in there traveling within your mind with psychedelics also can be a good way to learn. But I love the way you put that. Raise your hand and remember that leaders want to lead, but also people like to follow. And they say actually with psychedelics, sometimes you stumble into more signs of synchronicity. And the way you just put that, this idea of raise your hand and offer up help. I just read an essay from Ron Holiday about this idea of apprenticeship. Some of the greatest leaders, Bill Belichick, Ben Franklin, they started out as apprentices, and the way they became leaders was by first starting by making others look good. And I think as a young executive, that's an invaluable lesson. So switching gears a little bit, psychedelics in the industry has a lot of potential. What excites so many people, this ability to supercharge resilience to adversity and change. And Jasper, you're no stranger to both of those. How do you approach adversity and change?
My first thought, Ray, is that I think that everybody will deal with adversity and change differently. I think people are also faced with different challenges for sure. And I've had a pretty sort of standard background and upbringing, and not too much turmoil or issues there, but not a golden spoon either, if I get the sort of the correction, the metaphor correct. But I think the most important thing is that you have to figure out how you best deal with the adversity that you face or the changes that you face. And for me, I need to work through it. I actually don't know how I feel when I face change or adversity. I feel something, but I don't know what it means. And I have to really take the time to work through it. Definitely sleep on it if it's an acute kind of change. But I sometimes just need to talk it through or think it through or write it out or just sit on it and maybe do some research on it. So for me, the way that I deal with adversity and change is a very active engagement with the issue. Don't stick my head in the sand, but I also cannot, and some people can, just completely let it roll off my shoulders and just move on. I need to kind of make it my own. Maybe that's a good way of phrasing it, Ray. I'm very self-motivated. And if there is adversity or a change hitting me, I need to make it my own. I need to work through it myself, if that makes sense.
To own it. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. One little last question for the deep dive, Jasper. I know you're not a spokesman for the psychedelic industry and therapists in general, but what do you think is the prevailing sentiment of psychologists towards psychedelics?
Yeah, so I've had a few conversations or touches with this topic in my years, not that many, but I do know that there's some promising research that Johns Hopkins has done in recent years on psychedelics to treat, like I mentioned, also PTSD or anxiety-related issues, if I remember that correctly. So I think that the science, the validity that we talked about earlier about the science, I think that looks to be promising. And this is an area that warrants further research. And so I think there's something there already that I'm sure therapists will take note of. Now, the other issues that we raise about legality and financial compensation, people are going to be worried about that. If they're not in a state where it can be legally prescribed, or where they can get reimbursement for it through their payers, then they're going to be reluctant at best, and probably just standoffish to proceed with that. But I think what's interesting here, I think the other item that we talked about, the fourth area about kind of change in science is culture. And we might really see shifts in culture and patients. If it works as well as some of the studies show, and patients have run out of options in other areas with traditional therapy modalities, then they might be very eager to do so and actually approach their therapists. And that can change the dynamic. And sometimes that can go remarkably quick. Sometimes it takes much longer than one would want or expect. But I think the cultural aspect is probably the most interesting one here, to see how that develops.
Oh, I love that. I appreciate your take, your ability to synthesize, and this idea of legality and reimbursement. What a great, simple, easy takeaway as we look at shifts in the industry. And speaking of shifts, we've got one last little segment with you, Jasper. The deep dive was a pleasure. The next little segment is called the Soul Search, kind of a speed round. I'm going to ask you 4 questions. If you can, 10 seconds or less on the response. And the idea is to try to get a little bit of a window into the soul of Mr. Simons. Are you game?
Hit me.
Okay, question number 1. You are on a desert island for 5 years, Jasper. You only get music from one band or one artist. Who you got?
Recondite. It's a German EDM techno artist.
One more time, say it.
Recondite.
Recondite. Okay. Question number 2, Jasper, what setback or adversity in life has taught you the most?
I got turned down for a business plan after my bachelor's degree with my fellow friend and student Marcel, and we look cute in our oversized daddy's suits. We didn't get the money because they point out a fatal flaw in our business plan, but it was just such a wonderful experience, actually, even though it was a hard no. It was a real hard no.
Sometimes you got to look for the no. Okay, question number 3. What is one of the greatest lessons that either your father or your mother taught you?
I think I'd probably take more after my mom, who's passed away, but therefore I learned probably the most from my dad. And I would probably be more of being in the moment, living in the moment. I can be in my head. I can really live in my head. I'll travel, and I'll travel far in my head, but he would be much more grounded and sort of particular sort of indirect social connections. And I think that I've always kept that with me.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you for that share. Be in the moment, get out of your head if you can, be grounded and in the moment. Jasper, where can the viewers, the listeners find you? Any action items?
People can find me on LinkedIn or Twitter. But my ask of you is just go travel, go expand, stop feeding yourself with headlines. Just go read long form journalism, subscribe to a newspaper, pick up a book, travel to different countries, experience different cultures. That there's no better way to learn.
Oh, that's good. Ladies and gentlemen, Jasper Simons, Chief Publishing Officer of the APA. Thank you so much for joining the show.
Thanks, Ray.
Well, let's switch gears to the final segment of the show. Producer Kevin, we've got a segment where we pick 2 companies, give out a little bit of an applause and a little bit of a slap on the wrist. We call this segment a clap and a slap. So the clap, a round of applause, goes to Double Blind. They are taking the approach of teaching a man to fish in the psychedelic space. They're going direct to consumers and educating people in a really fun, useful, and safe manner. So a clap to you, Double Blind. And the slap goes to Compass Pathways. So they are allegedly trying, among a few other things, to trademark set and setting, to patent soft lighting and gentle furniture for psychedelic therapy, and perhaps worst of all, allegedly funding the opposition for legalization of psychedelics in Oregon, which ultimately passed, but Compass Pathways. Et tu, Brutus? Okay, so that's it for a clap and a slap. Thank you to Jasper Simons, producer Kevin. I'm Ray Christian. See you next time.